Good morning. Last week we looked at the end of the book of Joel, and we saw some very nice parallels with the New Testament, some very nice predictions in the days of Pentecost, and we concluded with this vision of the terrible day of the Lord that was approaching, and how those living in Joel's day, but also those living in the days of Peter that were there at Pentecost, were prepared for it to happen at any moment. Um, we're not going to stay in the minor prophets. We're going to move to what you might consider a minor epistle or a minor prophet in the New Testament. We're going to look at the book of James. In fact, there are some themes, not all the same themes, but there are some themes that are similar in the book of James to what we previously just looked at. But really, one of the distinctive characteristics of the book of James is that it has a wide variety of topics that it addresses. It is not an epistle like a Pauline epistle, like Paul would wrote, such as Romans or Galatians or Ephesians. It does not flow in the same way, meaning whereas Paul might have two or three topics he wants to nail the Corinthians on, or discuss with the Thessalonians, or even write to this letter to the Romans. James has a really a wide variety of things that he wants to address, and one of those things is suffering and trials, waiting for the coming of the Lord. And so there's a lot of biblical themes that are present in this book. I remember studying this book in depth when I was in college. When I was in college, we translated this book, and the particular professor I was under was writing a commentary on it at the time. So it was one of the first books that I looked at from a big picture perspective. That is, trying to understand what an author is doing from beginning to end. Which is kind of an ironic thing when you talk about the book of James, because that's really one of the big question marks about the book. What is the author trying to doing? What is he trying to do? What is he trying to do with this book? Does it have a central theme that he is arranging his thoughts and arguments around? Now, you might wonder, why are we asking that question? Well, that question is actually very, very important when we think about ancient books, or any book really. What is the author trying to say? We often think about that in a sentence or a paragraph, or even maybe a chapter. But when we talk about the Old and the New Testament, each book is making an argument, or maybe making several arguments, and it's important to understand what those arguments are. When we talk about something like, again, Romans, where it's about very specific topics that are leading towards these classical arguments about the gospel and about relationships between Jews and Gentiles, those points are well founded, because we're able to see them for the arguments that they are. But if something is less clear, or something is using a different type of argument, that makes it much more difficult. So, for instance, if we're comparing the book of James to Paul, we see it's a very different kind of letter, and we'll talk more about some of those aspects later. But if we're comparing the book of James to the book of Proverbs, we see a lot of similarity, and that's where many scholars have pointed to and said that the book of James is very much proverbial. It includes a lot of proverbs, includes a lot of wise sayings. And in fact, many of these wise sayings come from none other than the Lord. We see that there's a lot of Jesus's sayings coming into the book of James that are quotations, especially from the Sermon on the Mount, but other places. The person who wrote the book of James, and we'll get to that in a minute, knew the Lord. He knew the Lord well. He spent time with him. He knew the material stuck with him. The teachings of Jesus stuck with him. And as a result, his life was completely changed by these. And he wants the readers of this book to be changed by these wise sayings, and in particular the wise sayings of Jesus. So with that, let's go ahead and turn to the book itself. I'm not sure how far we will get in it this morning, because there are some very important features that we need to look at in the book of James with regards to its author, and with regards to its to how the author and the identification of the author plays a role in understanding the book. In fact, when we look at the book of James, I would say it's one of the few books where authorship makes a huge difference for understanding some of the statements in the book. And so I've entitled our series in the book of James, and it's 5 chapters, Wisdom from Above over Wisdom from Below. Now, that subtitle comes from James chapter 3. And this is what some scholars, and I would tend to agree with this, consider to be the core of the book, the peak of the book, where James' arguments are all coming together. And so let's first look, as we delve into this book, let's first look at authorship. Who wrote this book? How does this book fit into the canon? Because as we know, the Gospels were each written by the people that carry their name, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. And we know Acts was written by Luke, and we know that the epistles of Paul were written by Paul. At least most people believe that he wrote them. We have other epistles written by Peter. We have the 3 epistles written by John, of course, Revelation. And then we have these other 3 that are outstanding. Of course, we have the book of Hebrews, which we don't know who wrote. It's anonymous. And then we have Jude and we have James. Now, most people believe that the book of Jude was written by a man named Judas or Judah, which was the brother of Jesus. Most people also believe that the book of James was written by the brother of Jesus, also named James. But just so we're clear on all the different options, and for understanding why that is, in fact, the most likely scenario, let's look through all of the different Jameses, if that's the plural of James, in the New Testament. So we start with the second most famous James, and that is James, the brother of John, one of the sons of Zebedee. He appears a number of times in the Gospels, although we must say that despite being in the inner ring, along with James, John, and Peter, and Andrew, this inner 4 of the disciples, he, along with Andrew, are overshadowed by their brothers. But we know that James, the son of Zebedee, cannot be the author of the book, because he was actually the first of the disciples to be martyred. He was the first of the disciples to be killed. He was killed in the year 44 AD. We know this because the book of Acts tells us that in Acts chapter 12. It says, Herod the king, that would be Herod Agrippa the first, the grandson of Herod the Great, laid violent hands on some who belonged to the church. He killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. This is Acts 12, 1 through 2. And so that kind of eliminates James, the son of Zebedee, from contention as far as being the writer of the book of James. Our second candidate is James, the son of Alphaeus. This James was a disciple. He appears towards the end of the disciple list. We don't know really anything else about him in the New Testament. The last time he occurs is in the final list that we have in Acts chapter 1, which is right before we have the replacement of Judas in Acts chapter 1. And so this is really the beginning of the commissioning of the church, right before Pentecost. And nothing else is really said about this particular James. And so he's an unlikely source for being the writer of the book. Tradition has him going on missionary activity, I believe, to Egypt. And so most people consider him actually as a possible candidate to writing the book, but not a very high candidate on the list. We also know of another James mentioned offhandedly. In fact, this could be, in fact, a reference to James, the brother of Jesus, but some scholars believe he is just another James. He's mentioned in the different passages about the women that were at the tomb, that saw the empty tomb, and he's just mentioned as the son of a woman named Mary. This woman, Mary, is identified by her two children, Joseph and James. If this is not Mary, the mother of the Lord, of Christ, and her other sons, then this would be another James. But again, it seems unlikely that this randomly mentioned James would be the writer of the book of James. Now, it's also possible that we have an unmentioned James that's not in the New Testament that writes this book, and some scholars have suggested that. But in the end, the fifth option is probably the best. And I would say not only is it the best, it makes the most historical sense, makes the best sense from a New Testament perspective, but it's the most impactful for understanding what has transpired over the course of the author's life. And once we see that it is James, the brother of Jesus, who wrote this book, we can take on so many different aspects of Jesus's early childhood and life, and the fact that his brothers don't believe in him, and what that means now to this person who is going to not only believe in the Lord, but serve as the leader of this early Christian community, and then eventually suffer martyrdom. But then we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's talk about what we know about James, the brother of Jesus. Well, he's not just the brother of Jesus. He's actually the brother of several other characters that occur in the New Testament, most notably Jude. And I'll focus on this last verse here. It says in Jude 1, Jude, a servant of Jesus Christ and a brother of James. Most people consider this to be one of the key verses in not only identifying Jude with the brother of Jesus, that is called Judas in other passages, Matthew 13:55 and Mark 6:3, but also this constellation of James, Jude, and Jesus, all put in connection with one another, seems to connect them with the family of Mary and Joseph, which of course would be Jesus's family. Now, the other reference is in that passage in the Synoptics, and it reads, "Is not this the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary? Are not his brothers James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas?" And of course, it's relating the fact that they're saying this can't be the Messiah, because we know Mary and we know about his father, the carpenter or craftsman named Joseph, and we have these sons in front of us, and we also know from other passages that there's sisters that are mentioned. So now that's written derisively towards Jesus, that they're making these statements, but actually records some very important information. It gives us these names that we wouldn't have otherwise. Now, we don't know anything about Joseph or Simon, other than the fact that in Acts 1, we're told that Jesus's brothers do in fact believe. But we do know, as I said, about James and Judas. In fact, I'd like to focus on these two names because it's rather odd that we call them by the names James and Jude. There's a couple reasons why I'm glad that these names have been changed, or they've been, let's say, transformed in different languages. Number one, I would say, for Jude is if Jude's name doesn't get changed from Yehuda or Judah to Judas to Jude, then we don't get the famous and wonderful all-time song, Hey Jude by the Beatles. It just doesn't have quite the ring to it if it says, Hey Judas. But that is actually the name. It's Judas, which is actually the Greek form of Judah, which is our English way of saying Yehuda. It's none other than the name of the tribe, Judah, that we're very well familiar with. And it was a very common name, Jude or Judas or Judah. So Jesus's brother, his second famous brother, Judah or Jude, has a name that we can see we can see how that would fit. Jude, Judas, Judah, they all kind of sound the same. But what about James? What is James' name? This is, in fact, this might sound odd to us, and I remember reading about it for the very first time, and kind of being taken aback that the name James isn't James, and how do we get that? And this isn't just a factoid, although it is that in some ways. So if you know, or you yourself are named James or Jimmy, know that your background isn't really connected with with James. It actually has a very different background than you might think. All of let's say this, the name James does not appear anywhere in the Bible, in either the Old Testament or the New Testament. So how do we get to call the brother of Jesus? And so just as confirmation, it's pretty clear that James, the brother of Jesus, is the writer of the book. But his name actually isn't James. How do we get to call him James? Why is that? Well, if we look at the Greek of the book of James, we see that his name is actually Jacob. And I know many of you don't read Greek, but you can actually make out this word here. If you just account for this weird looking letter, that's an omega, it says Jokobus. And you can compare that to the same name in Genesis, Jacob or Jacob in the Septuagint, or Yaakov in Hebrew. How do we get from Jacob to James? What causes that? Well, by the 13th century and over time, the name Jacob in Latin had become Iocomus. And you can see how that spelling there. And in the 14th century, when we have one of the earliest attempts at translating the Latin, or translating the Bible into English in Wycliffe's famous Bible translation, he decided to transliterate the name of the brother of Jesus as James. Now, the ironic thing is that the same name in Genesis for the person that we know of as Jacob, the son of Isaac and brother of Esau, he transliterated as Jacob. And so you imagine having the same name in the same source, in these different sources, and transliterating it in completely different ways. But that's really kind of exactly what he did. And you can actually see this. This was a lot of fun. I spent a little too much time tracking this down. But this is an original printing of the Wycliffe Bible, and it's fun to read here in Middle English. It says, Epistle of James, the Apostle, and you can see right there with this long J, James, the servant of God. And so this is, again, it's one of the first English Bibles. It's a really cool artifact in of itself. But you can see that from this point in the 14th century, late 14th century, we have people starting to refer to the brother of Jesus as James. And so that changes things. Now, I wouldn't say that it's some gross sin or anything like that, but it does cause a few things to be misseen. And for one, it's just kind of shocking to think that you've been calling a major biblical character by the wrong name for your whole life, which it was for me. But it does change some aspects that are worth mentioning. One of them is quite interesting, I would say, in Matthew 1, which is Matthew's genealogy of Jesus. We have a long list of the different people that Jesus is related to, starting with Abraham and all the way down to Joseph. And in this genealogy, it is said that Joseph's father is actually named Jacob. Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born. Now, even until today, our naming conventions follow this. I was just with my father-in-law yesterday, and my kids were playing around, and we're doing the social distance thing. And he made the comment, if you have another son, you got to continue with this family name. And of course, we did the same thing with our oldest. We have several different Charleses with first names on both sides of my family, and my first name is Charles, so he gets that designation, Charles. And the same thing was done in the ancient world. You often are named after someone in your family history. And so Jacob's father, again, according to Matthew's genealogy, and I don't want to get into the debate with its relationship to Luke, he was named seemingly after his grandfather. And if you don't see that, if his name's James, when it in fact is exactly the same spelling in Matthew 1:16 to where we read his name later in the New Testament, you miss that there's this family connection between Joseph and Mary's second son and his past and his family history. Now, another aspect of this is that, again, James doesn't appear in the Bible, and it doesn't appear in the Second Temple period. It's not a name that exists then. But once we understand that his name is in fact Jacob, we understand that this is a very common Jewish name. It's common until today, in fact. But there's different studies because there's so many inscriptions from this period. And Tali Lan, who I've cited here, she concludes that it is in fact the 15th most popular name in the Second Temple period within Israel, and the third most popular outside in the so-called diaspora, which we'll talk a little about later, because that word diaspora appears in the very first verse of the book. And so Jacob, or James, fits in with much of what we know about the names of Jewish men living in the Second Temple period. Just another kind of rabbit trail here, a factoid. Joseph and Jesus and Judah also are extremely popular names. These are in your baby book. If you are naming boys in the Second Temple period, they're really high up on the list. And finally here, there really is something missed if we call him James and we miss it in the first verse of the book. He says, Jacob, and he talks about who he is, to the 12 tribes in the diaspora. There's an inherent wordplay or an inherent a connection of an idea between the 12 tribes. What are these 12 tribes? They're from Jacob. They are from Jacob, who was renamed Israel, that we read in Genesis. In fact, Jacob is used as a name for Israel all throughout the Old Testament, from Genesis all the way through the prophets. And so we can see this Jacob character, the brother of Jesus, referring to himself, and then kind of like in a fun way, talking about these 12 tribes in the diaspora. I don't think he's claiming that they are from him, but he's got this shared history with them that's bound up in his name. And so we might call this book the Book of Jacob, not really the Book of James. In fact, there are There are those who would suggest that we should change the name, and I actually would be in agreement with that. But it might not be a hill to die on when we talk about this book. There's several interesting articles out there that are worth reading on this subject. But I think just a recognition, at the very least, that his name is not James, but it is in fact Jacob, is worth understanding. Okay, so moving on, and again, today we're going to focus primarily on who James is, who Jacob is, and the next topic is to try and understand what the Gospels and then what the rest of the New Testament tells us about James, the brother of Jesus. And again, there's a lot bound up in these ideas in the New Testament. The first is seems quite obvious, and that is that by the fact that James is the brother of Jesus, and he has these other brothers, it means that James's parents were Mary and Joseph, and that seems pretty straightforward. But if you thought that, you would, I say you'd be right, but it's a very controversial point. Why is it a controversial point? Well, beginning in the 3rd century, maybe even a little bit earlier, but definitely 3rd and 4th century, we have the development of the theological idea that Mary, the mother of Jesus, was a perpetual virgin, and she lived her life as a perpetual virgin, in light of what we read about in Matthew and Luke about the fact that she was a virgin when she conceived and bore Jesus. And so this is called the Epiphanian view. It's argued by a number of early church fathers. It, of course, is part of Catholic doctrine, Roman Catholic doctrine, until today. Now, this view was disputed early on. This view in dispute is called the Helvidian view. This would be the same view that most Protestants would hold to, and I think the view that makes the most sense, that Mary was the mother of these brothers of Jesus, as well as these unnamed sisters. Now, to kind of flesh this out a little bit further, the view of the Roman Catholic Church, which is based on really ancient tradition, is that these other brothers were from a previous marriage of Joseph. And so this actually really changes the dynamic. It would mean that all of these brothers that are mentioned with Jesus are much older, or at least, I don't know how much older, but are older than Jesus. Whereas for what we're saying is that these brothers of Jesus were younger. How much younger? Well, it's hard to say, probably a few years younger than Jesus. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on that, but that's really a divide between Protestantism and Catholicism, and of course, it's over really the question of how significant Mary is in terms of this theology. So this is really one of the tenets of a high view of Mary and her role in the church today. Whereas I think that the evidence again points pretty strongly to these being her sons. In any case, the Gospels continue to move through, and they give us some other information about James and the brothers of Jesus. For instance, John 2 tells us that James, as well as his other brothers, moved with Mary, key point there, with Jesus to Capernaum. So when he makes his move from Nazareth, where they had all grew up, to Capernaum, his brothers go with him. This is corroborated also by the Synoptic Gospels. And one of my favorite lines, when they come out of Capernaum and they're looking for him, and the crowd say, "Jesus, your family's looking for you." And Jesus says, his response is, "Whoever listens to me, these are my family." And he even uses them as a kind of a teaching tool. Now, John 7 also tells us something very important, and I would say that this is the things that we're going to talk about today, one of the most important features for understanding the book. And that is that James, along with his other brothers, do not believe that Jesus is the Messiah. They don't believe it. They've spent time with him. They've grown up with him. They've seen his miracles firsthand, and yet they don't believe. They don't believe. How can that be? Well, we could make a couple of arguments. I think the best one is to look at like a passage like Luke 4, where Jesus makes the comment after saying that this passage that he's read from Isaiah, that it is fulfilled in your hearing, and they try to kill him. And Jesus makes the comment that even a prophet is not loved by his own hometown. This idea of familiarity breeds contempt. Excuse me. So James and Jude, or Jacob and Judas, or Judah, as well as these other brothers, they don't believe that Jesus is the Messiah. Now, another point that is highlighted by this is that in John's gospel, when Jesus is on the cross, he looks out and he sees the people that are there. Apparently, his brothers aren't even there. In fact, the people that John has there at the foot of the cross are himself, the disciple whom Jesus loved, and his mother. And we have this very just unbelievable and evocative scene where Jesus from the cross gives his mother's charge over to John the Apostle, which is so telling for a couple of different reasons. It's telling in that Jesus was concerned with the honor and the protection of his mother all the way to the point of death, which is a whole other topic, but it brings in these ideas of honor and protection. Of course, Jesus himself, as the oldest surviving son of the family, was his job was to protect his family, including his mother. And it's also telling that he doesn't say, James, look after mom. It's John who's given this. Why is this? Well, many believe because his brothers don't believe at this point. Well, thankfully, the story doesn't end there. The rest of the New Testament tells us a great deal about James, the brother of Jesus. The most important event in James's life occurs in a kind of an unlikely text. It appears in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 7, which is Paul giving us a list of the people and peoples that Jesus appeared to in his resurrection. And it mentions specifically that James saw the Lord, that James received a visit from his brother. One can only imagine what this might have been like to not believe. And yet still, we can probably imagine, again, we can't know for sure, but there's certain family affection there between James and his older brother. And to see his brother rise from the dead and appear to him must have been something that was transformational. And of course, it was transformational. We read in Acts, if we put these two texts together, 1 Corinthians and Acts 1, that his brothers do now believe. It says in Acts, again, 1:14, that his brothers are there waiting for Pentecost, that Jesus has ascended and his brothers are there. They're joined now to this Jerusalem community, this Jerusalem church, which is just starting right after the death of the Lord, right after his resurrection and ascension, 40 days after Passover. A few days later, Pentecost is going to occur, and the church is really going to explode. And as we know in the book of Acts, it's Peter who is this pillar in the church, this main leader who is the driving force behind these evangelistic messages in Acts 2 and Acts 3 and so on. But as it turns out, it's going to be James who is going to emerge as the main leader in the church. How do we know that? Well, the book of Acts really tells us to, if you read between the lines. Now, before I forget it, I'll just say this. If we think that the first church is started in Jerusalem, which it definitely appears to be, and that's really the argument of the book of Acts, that I'm going to send forth my spirit and it will come into Jerusalem and Judea and then into Samaria and then to the ends of the earth. So if Jerusalem is this first mother church, and if there is such a thing as a pope, which I would dispute, but in any case, then the leader of the Jerusalem church would be the leader of the whole church, right? At least that's the way tradition has argued for the primacy of Peter as the pope, the first pope. But actually, even that is wrong, because the first leader of the Jerusalem church is none other than James, which we've said is Jacob or Yaakov. So it's really interesting then that the first so-called pope of Jerusalem would have as Jewish a name as you can possibly imagine, Jacob. But again, he is not marked by this type of theology either, but he is this extremely important leader in the early church. And we'll see that now. How do we know that? Well, we can put together a couple different sources, mostly the book of Acts and Galatians. Galatians 1 and 2 give us a lot of chronological information about Paul and Jerusalem's relationship, and specifically James, John, and Peter and Paul's relationship. In 36 or 37 AD, Paul met James in Jerusalem. This is where the first meeting we have. It's not mentioned explicitly in Acts, but Galatians 1 verse 18 fills that out, that Paul and James met at this moment. Now, later on, in another visit to Jerusalem, we have James meeting with Paul and Barnabas in Jerusalem. This one is somewhat more substantial. This is where we have the idea that they're given the right hand of fellowship. Now, in both of these passages, we have James present at Jerusalem, and we also know Peter's there as well. But these two pillars, as Paul will describe them, along with John, are the bedrock of this church. They're the main leadership community in Jerusalem. And the fact that they are the ones given the responsibility to okay Paul's ministry shows their great significance. And then we have something that is extremely significant, and that is the death of James the apostle and the imprisonment of Peter. This happens, and it's well dated to 44 AD. How do we know that it's well dated to 44 AD? Well, we know that because Herod Agrippa dies in 44 AD, and that's mentioned in the next chapter, at the end of this chapter, in the book of Acts. So he kills James, the brother of John. He then imprisons Peter, and presumably on the next morning, Peter is going to be executed as well. And in the account, Peter is freed from prison by an angel. He then comes to this church community, and one of the first things he's out of his mouth is, "Tell James and the other brothers." This shows the equality, if not the superiority, of James and the early church community, that James and Peter are these key figures. Now, another important one, perhaps the most important of all of these, is the Jerusalem Council. And again, there's a debate, but maybe 48, 49 AD, just a few years later. It is after we have the hearing or the presentation of different ideas from Peter and Paul and Barnabas about how the church community is to relate to Gentiles coming in. Do they become Jews? Do they get circumcised? Do they have to first become Jews before they become Christians? After all of this material is presented, I mean, you could not ask for a higher council in terms of people that are there unless the Lord Jesus was there at this meeting. We have Peter, we have Barnabas, we have Paul, presumably we have others. John would all kind of be a notable absence. Maybe he's there, maybe he's not. It is James who gives the judgment in Acts 15:12-21. He gives the judgment on what and how they are to proceed with Gentile believers. And so if we think about this impact, that Gentiles don't need to become Jews first to believe, it is tied to many different scriptures, but the most fundamental church decision is made in the mother church and by its leader. Its pronouncement is given by James at the so-called Jerusalem Council. Now, finally, at least in the book of Acts, we have James greeting Paul as he is coming to Jerusalem for the last time in the book. This dates, again, very well dated to 57 AD. Paul has left at the end of his third missionary journey. He's come from Corinth. He's made his way across the Mediterranean Sea, and he's making his way to Jerusalem during Passover. And at Passover, he's going to be arrested, and it's James that meets him there. Again, we see James as this stalwart, this person who is in Jerusalem all the time as the book of Acts is unfolding, and remaining this faithful pastor, the senior pastor, if you want, or this faithful leader of the church. Now, Paul talks about him this way, and this is back probably in 47, 48 AD, when he describes coming to Jerusalem. And he says, James and Cephas and John, who seemed to me to be pillars, received the grace that was given to me. They gave the right hand of fellowship to Barnabas and me, that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. So we have this division of labor, that these three, John, Cephas is another name for Peter, and James, their job, their responsibility was to teach and enrich the Jews. And therefore, their responsibility is to establish churches in the Jewish community, whereas Paul and Barnabas are going to be set out on these missionary journeys to go to the Gentiles. Now, of course, we know that Paul always followed the idea that the Jew first, and then he would move on to Gentiles. Now, the key part in this passage is the way that John, Peter, and James are described. We would not think in reading the Gospels that James, the brother of Jesus, is a pillar. We would not think of him as a main leader on par with Peter and John, but that's exactly the way Paul saw him. And so historically, and in the way that we think about the growth of the early church, we need to consider James on the same level. He has this much influence, this much impact upon the early church. Now, this language, pillar, this is not just metaphorical. Of course, they're not actually made of stone, but it is metaphorical in some sense, but it is connected to a concrete idea, the idea of a temple. This image that we have below us shows a model of what Herod's temple looked like, and you can see the entrance of the temple with its recessed pillars, and then especially this building next to it called the Royal Stoa, where the Sanhedrin met. It's a building that's 3 or 4 stories high with absolutely enormous pillars. Guess who meets there? Sanhedrin, the leaders of the Jewish community. So there can be this idea then that these 3 figures are the leaders of the church, that they are on par in this early Christian community with the Sanhedrin, James, Peter, and John. And I'll say, who's mentioned first? James. He has become really the leader of the church, and that bears itself out over the course of the book. Well, I don't want to spend too much time on these other aspects, but we actually know a lot about the death of James. James dies right around the same time as Peter and Paul, just died a couple years after this. And we don't have the death of James written in the New Testament, but Josephus gives us, that's the Jewish Roman historian, gives us some very important details about him. This comes from the Antiquities of the Jews, and here's a look at what some people consider to be Flavius Josephus, although it's heavily debated, but maybe this is kind of what it looked like. Festus was now dead. Now you might remember Festus from the book of Acts, where Paul was imprisoned. We know his procuratorship ended in 62 when he died, and the new one, Albinus, was being sent from somewhere else in the Roman Empire to take up shop in Caesarea. Josephus says he's on the road. So he's talking about Ananias, or most likely Hanan, was the high priest at the time. Now this guy, Ananias, was the son of Annas from the Gospels. The main power broker behind the capture and eventual crucifixion of Jesus. This is his son. So this shows you the long-standing influence of Annas. So Ananias assembled the Sanhedrin of the judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ or Messiah, whose name was John, and some others. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, Torah, he delivered them to be stoned. But as for those who seemed the most equitable of the citizens, and such as were the most uneasy at the breach of the laws, they disliked what was done. They also sent to the king, this would be Herod Agrippa II, Agrippa the first's son, desiring him to send to Ananias that he should act so no more, for that what he had already done was not to be justified. So we have the details about the execution, about the martyrdom of James, the brother of Jesus. He died in the year 62, and apparently over issues surrounding the law. Now, this same designation, except for the death by stoning as opposed to crucifixion, can be connected with Jesus. If Josephus recorded this information about Jesus, it would have been more or less the same way. And it also reminds us, of course, of Stephen. And so this key leader, James, underwent a total transformation that ultimately ended in martyrdom in the temple, the place that he worshiped. In fact, this is corroborated by a 2nd century church father, I hope I get this name right, Hegesippus, something like that. He wrote this around 180 AD. We don't have his texts, but the church historian Eusebius records and compiles many of these texts. And he basically corroborates this information and adds maybe some other flair. He talks about how James was thrown from the pinnacle of the temple, and we don't know how historical any of that is. But he gives us some really interesting information about it. He says the following: James, the Lord's brother, was wont to go into the temple, and he used to be found kneeling on his knees, begging forgiveness for the people, so that the skin of his knees became horny like that of a camel's. Very nice descriptive language. And he's actually, this is quite an unbelievable statement about James, that he would come to the temple and pray for the forgiveness of Jews, for the forgiveness of his brethren. And if that's true, and it seems to be so, how does that also fit in with the fact that they were exactly the ones, the leaders anyway, who put him to death? All right, and then continuing on this, it says, therefore, in consequence of his preeminent justice, he was called the Just. And so tradition calls James the Just. We also have this other name, which we don't really understand, Oblius, which signifies in Greek defense of the people and justice in accordance with what the prophets declare concerning him. And so, at least according to this early church historian, there were actually prophecies about James. Well, after recording his death, this Hegesippus tells us that he suffered martyrdom and they buried him on the spot. And there was a pillar erected to his memory there that still remains. He's probably mistaken about this. This is probably the pillar of Absalom, which basically anybody that's notable that died in Jerusalem is said to have been buried there, gets associated with this pillar. But in any case, it is true that James does die in Jerusalem. He's killed by the Sanhedrin. And at the end of this quotation, he tells us that it's right before Vespasian came to came to Judea, which would mean that James's death has to be dated before 66. And so this is corroborating the death of James. Now, finally today, we're going to look at our last outside source to talk about James. Now, the first thing I'd say is that we don't need anything else to tell us who James is. The Gospels tell us about him. The book of Acts tells us about him. Most significantly of all, we have Corinthians and Galatians, which fill in important gaps into the chronology, and most especially the fact that James saw the risen Lord. But we have a possible one outside of the New Testament that is quite interesting, even though it's quite controversial. Now, the image that you see here is a ossuary. It's about this big, if I can do that. It's meant to, it's a coffin, but not a coffin that we're familiar with. Today, in coffins, you bury the whole person and put them in and embalm them. Not so in Jewish, not so in Jewish burials in the Second Temple period. They would actually take the deceased person's body and put them in a limestone cave until the flesh and muscles and everything else had decayed. And then after that process was over, it usually took about a year, they would take the skeletal remains, the bones, and put them inside of this bone box or ossuary. So the size of these ossuaries is related to the width, which would be your skull of the widest bone, and the length of the longest bone, which would be the femur. And so these ossuaries have been found in the thousands in Second Temple Judea, and especially in Jerusalem. And so there's not anything necessarily unique about this box, and most everyone considers this ossuary to be authentic. It is an authentic Second Temple ossuary. And into that, it's an important artifact. Now, it was found, or it was purchased by Israel from the antiquities market, not because it was an ossuary, but because it's an ossuary with an important inscription. On the side, and you can maybe make these letters out faintly here, and you can see a blow-up of them here, and if you know Hebrew or actually Aramaic, you can read this, and here's the translation. Yaakov, son, and that word here, son, is not Hebrew, it's Aramaic bar. So like Bar Abbas, Bar Abbas is not a name, it's actually son of Abbas, so son of a father. Yaakov bar, or son of Yosef, which would be Joseph, so Jacob, son of Joseph, brother of Yeshua. Now Yeshua, of course, is the name Jesus, the way we would translate Jesus. Now, if you put those three names together, this could be quite significant. This could be none other than the ossuary of Jacob, or James, the brother of Jesus. Now, in and of itself, this is an interesting thing. On the one hand, if it is authentic, it doesn't have to be James or Jacob from the book of James. It could be just another guy who had this family history. Because, as I've said, Jacob, Jesus, and Joseph are very, very popular names in Judea and also out throughout the wider Jewish diaspora. But one key distinction is that this ossuary mentions brother. Now, it was quite common on ossuaries, and really just inscriptions in general, to refer to a person by their father. But to refer to someone by their brother is quite rare. And this reminds us too of Jude 1, where Jude says he is the brother of James. So this designates the fact that this brother is quite famous, and perhaps somebody would know that. Now, what makes this find, which could be one of the most fantastic archaeological discoveries ever for New Testament studies, problematic, is that it was found in the antiquities market, and the person who it was purchased from was known to have forged other items. And so once it was purchased, it went on display, but then it was pulled from a museum display, and then a huge debate in museum, a huge trial actually took place over the veracity of this particular inscription. Again, they're not questioning the artifact, they're questioning the inscription. And so there's been all kinds of different opinions on if the inscription is legitimate or if it's faked later. They've looked at the patina, the little remains inside the letters. They've tested it. Some said it's definitely a fake. Others say now, no, it's definitely authentic. At the end of the day, we don't know. We don't know. But as I said, it's a potential really cool find, but at the end also, it doesn't really tell us anything that we don't know. We know that Jacob existed. We know his brother was Jesus. We know his father was Joseph. And so this information would be cool, but until maybe future studies are able to confirm or deny its legitimacy, it's just something that's part of our information about James. Now, if I go back here and just kind of in conclusion to our day's topics, there's something there that's also important, and I'll just end with this kind of devotional thought. James undoubtedly, whether it's this box or another one like it, or if he was buried in the ground, he died. He ended up in a box like this. Jesus didn't. Jesus, after 3 days in the tomb, rose from the dead. He didn't stick around, no matter what Discovery Channel documentary you may have heard about the tomb of Jesus. He didn't make it to an ossuary. Jesus rose from the dead, and he lives. How do we know it? Well, by faith. We know it by faith, and that's really important. But one of the things that is most impactful to me is to think about the testimony of his brother, the testimony of James, that he doesn't believe at all. He doesn't believe that Jesus is the Messiah at all. And he sees the risen Lord, and he believes. How much does he believe? He believes so much. He's motivated so much that he rises to the leadership of the early church community. He believes so much that he is involved with the major decision makings that are going to totally shape the world, even until today, as I am a Gentile in South Texas talking about someone living 2,000 years ago, making these decisions to spread the gospel, which is inherently Jewish, to Gentiles. He believes so much that he is willing to die for this truth. This is just a total testimony to the transformative power of the gospel that is only powerful if we have a full resurrection. And this is what James believed in to the point of death. And we have evidence of that in Josephus, evidence of that in the early church history, and perhaps potential evidence of this here in this box. Now, again, that's truth for us to believe in the death and resurrection of our Lord and the veracity of it. Next week, we will look at the beginning of the book, James chapter 1. Hope you enjoyed our study today, and look forward to future studies together.